For our lecture tonight, which is entitled The Public Trust and the Precautionary Principle, Visionary Tools for the Environment and Public Health, we have here tonight two dynamic and dedicated speakers with a wealth of expertise between them. I'm going to speak first about Carolyn Raffensperger. One of James Watt's unplanned environmental progeny, Carolyn Raffensperger left a career as an archaeologist in the Southwest to stake a claim for the earth as a place of beauty and wholeness, rather than as an object to be exploited. As executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, a consortium of organizations promoting science and ethics in the public interest, Carolyn is part of a movement to democratize science and to put it to work for the common good. When she left her archaeology career in 1982, Carolyn went to the Sierra Club, where she ran their Chicago office for 8 years, addressing an array of environmental systems, including forest management, river protection, pesticide pollutants, and disposal of radioactive waste. 6 years into her tenure with the Sierra Club, she decided that in order to defend the natural world in court, she would need a law degree. She completed law school and began working for the Science and Environmental Health Network in 1994. As an environmental lawyer, Carolyn specializes in the fundamental changes in law and policy necessary for the protection and restoration of public health and the environment. Carolyn is co-editor of Protecting Public Health and the Environment, Implementing the Precautionary Principle, a very important piece of work published by Island Press in 1999. This volume is the most comprehensive exploration to date of the history, theory, and implementation of the precautionary principle. She writes the Science for Lawyers column of the Environmental Law Institute's journal Environmental Forum. And in addition, she serves on the editorial review boards for several environmental and sustainable agriculture journals, and has served on the U.S. EPA and National Research Council committees. She's been featured in many magazines, I won't go through all of them, and now lives in Iowa, where she and her husband, Fred Kirschenmann, run a 3,500-acre organic farm in North Dakota. Our second speaker today, Martha Dina Arguello, is currently the Director of Health and Environmental Programs for Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles and coordinator of community action to fight asthma. A California activist with 25 years experience, she started organizing in her teens. She worked for a couple of years in the Ministry of Health in Nicaragua, her parents' country of origin, and it was while working as a health educator in the breast cancer early detection program for uninsured women in Los Angeles that she had the opportunity to hear Sandra Steingraber and Michael Lerner speak at an event sponsored by the Breast Cancer Fund. She describes that experience as her epiphany on the convergence of toxics and public health, and where she needed to pool her organizing and creative energies. In her tenure with Physicians for Social Responsibility, Martha Dina has expanded the environmental health programs to include pesticide reform, air quality, energy and health, environmental justice organizing, and working with the Healthcare Without Harm Coalition. In 1999, when she was reading Carolyn Raffensperger's book on implementing the precautionary principle, the phone rang in the PSR office, and she answered it and found Carolyn on the other end of the phone. Shortly thereafter, Carolyn invited Martha Dina to join the board of directors of SEHN, and she also serves on the steering committee of Californians for Pesticide Reform, the LAUSD Community Pest Management Team, and the Latino Issue Forum's Water and Energy Advisory Groups. I have to just tell you this really funny story. Some of you have probably seen the wonderful little poster that we sent around advertising for this program. Lynn Fessenden sent one down to Martha Dina in California, but she didn't tell her she was doing that. And it arrived on her desk, and she saw it, and she noticed that there was a lecture that was going to happen where people were going to put together the public trust and precautionary principle together. And the first thing that went through her mind was, I want to be there. I want to hear that lecture. Well, we want to hear that lecture, and we're going to get to. After the lecture that will be delivered by Carolyn and Martha, we are also going to be privileged to have a special guest join us for a few remarks to begin the discussion and question portion of the program. That special guest is one of the treasures of our community, Mary O'Brien, who has served as a public interest scientist with grassroots organizations for the past 19 years. Based here in Eugene, she's worked for the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides, the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, and the Environmental Research Foundation. Mary has spent 4 years as an ecosystems policy analyst for the Hells Canyon Preservation Council, 2 years as an assistant professor of public interest science and environmental advocacy at the University of Montana Graduate Environmental Studies program. Mary is a botanist by training, and she has long advocated for citizen involvement in science-based decision-making, as well as encouraged scientists to be advocates. Her research is focused on alternatives to toxics and to risk assessment, and she's the author of Making Better Environmental Decisions, an Alternative to Risk Assessment, which she recommends as a simple but profound shift for another decision-making technique. She also serves as president of the board of directors of the Oregon Toxics Alliance. So, let the lecture begin, and afterwards we hope you will join us for a reception immediately afterwards. We'll have the presentations, questions, and then some informal time together. I hope you will join me in warmly welcoming Carolyn and Martha Dina.
Before I start, I should say that anything I say is really a product of many people's thinking. And certainly Mary O'Brien's work has been foundational for the things that I'm going to discuss tonight. And what I want to discuss tonight, I want to dedicate to Joy, known as Mama Majani, and to acacia and to tundra and antelope and the Serengeti, to Fender's blue butterfly, Kincaid's lupin, prairie, elephant, baobab, savanna, red-band trout, mule deer, bunch grass, the microbiotic crust, and most of all, coyote. May the spirit of coyote be present in all of her trickster forms tonight and always. And may all of those who defend her live long in our memory and in this world. I want to tell you about the night that I was sitting in a very dark restaurant in Ames, Iowa, with a handful of people from Iowa State University who'd been assigned to entertain Barry Lopez, the brilliant natural history writer that you all know so well from Oregon. Lopez said something that woke me up from that relaxed cocktail hour quietude. He said that the U.S. form of government was a 200-year-old experiment, and it has failed. The original experiment was set up for 3 branches of government with checks and balances between the 3 branches. You know all that. It's the way it's supposed to work, and we had a little a trial and error with that the recent election. Along the way, we inadvertently created a 4th branch, corporations. But we don't have any checks and balances on that 4th branch. Lopez argued that we need a new experiment. We either have to depose the 4th branch and regulate corporations appropriately, or we have to build in checks and balances and legally acknowledge that we have 4 branches: the judicial, the executive, the legislative, and the corporate branch. Lopez's comment is intriguing. How should we assess the government? And what can we do about the failures? Often, when I speak about my topic today, the precautionary principle and the public trust doctrine, I incant a litany of loss and degradation. The litany is usually sufficient evidence to know that Lopez is right. The experiment has failed. I go through the increases in cancer adjusted for age, the increases in autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders, the rise in infectious diseases associated with environmental change, and sometimes I neatly segue into the state of marine fisheries, forests, Arctic mammals, climate, or freshwater rivers. When I give this bad news, I'm trying to make the case that we need to go about environmental protection and restoration in a different way. But as I've thought about it, we've got other systems in disarray that suggest that more than the environment with a small e is in trouble. It's something more than the likelihood that we've damaged a generation of children's brains or consigned a generation of women to mastectomies or that we've emptied out the oceans. As if that isn't enough. Our human institutions are failing. Look at healthcare, look at agriculture, look at energy. Every one of those sectors is in a state of chaos and near collapse. All of them interact with the environment in substantial and destructive ways. Physicians are a clear example. Healthcare is unaffordable for patients. It cures but rarely prevents disease. Physicians can't afford malpractice insurance. Hospitals themselves are environmental problems with an intractable medical waste volume. Medical care uses toxic chemicals in treatment, and so on. How can it be that in treating someone's cancer, we may give their very own child cancer? Similarly, agriculture is producing environmental devastation as measured by the dead zone in the Gulf and many other places around the world. We have mad cow disease, we have PCBs and dioxins contaminating the salmon, we have genetically modified organisms like starling corn contaminating the entire food supply. Chronic diseases like diabetes and obesity plague Americans, yet we have starvation in other countries. And I could go on. I'm going to leave energy for another talk because the list is equally horrific. Regardless of the metric, they all seem to demonstrate that this government, if not this form of government, has failed to protect the Commonwealth for this and future generations. I have an intensified interest in the working of government since I just participated in my first Iowa caucus. I say I lost my caucus virginity. I voted in primaries, but everything about caucusing was new. And a conservative commentator, David Brooks, writing for the New York Times, sums up what I felt about the caucuses with this description. He said, "We've learned a lot about the Democratic Party over the past few weeks, culminating with the astounding Kerry and Edwards victories last night. We've learned that most Democrats are not really furious at Washington Democrats. They desperately want to remove Bush, but they're not haters. They're not out to punish everybody who voted for the Iraq War resolution." And he goes on to say, "I'm struck by how oblivious this campaign has been to the consequences of 9/11. I'm struck by how the grand idealism of the crowds is out of proportion to the smallish policies on offer. Nonetheless, it's sort of inspiring in this cold Iowa winter to see at least some Americans who have preserved, despite decades of discouragement, a stubborn faith in politics and the possibility of change." After thinking about Brooks' analysis, it seems that regardless of political affiliation, Republican or Democrat, that many Americans, many of us, have a grand idealism, and yet we're handed smallish policies, little vision. Too often, the smallish policies we are given are going to dig us deeper into the mess rather than prevent the mess or clean up the ones we've already got. Friends, perhaps we've been waiting for them, whomever they might be, to hand us the grand vision. Well, why don't we stop waiting? Why don't we gather together and use our political imagination and hand the politicians our grand vision? Why don't we design another experiment? You know, here I'm reminded of Thoreau's really interesting quote. "Do not be too moral. You might cheat yourself out of much life. Aim high above morality. Be not simply good. Be good for something." And you know, government needs to be good for something. Ben Franklin did this regularly. He saw a need and created an institution. He invented the fire department and the library, among other things. We're in need of new institutions and new ways of organizing ourselves so we can live on this sweet earth in the company of all the other beings. So, let me start spinning and weaving and mending with you tonight. Let's begin with what government might be for. The current administration, and I don't mean to hammer on the current administration, since most of the administrations, probably since Reagan, articulate the theory that government is to enforce national interests ensure national security, and protect property rights. In fact, I went to law school, and don't hold that against me. But, you know, almost every single class was about how to defend property rights. That is the basis for American law. The basis for American law is not how to maintain peace or establish peace. It is to defend property rights. So our government is designed to protect humans in this generation and their property rights. It's predicated on competition. It measures success on the basis of economic efficiency and encourages the privatization of goods and services, especially if property is the whole reason for us creating a body of law. And while national security and property may be important, there's another view of government that might provide the grander vision that people that I'm hungry for. That is, government's primary duty is to serve as the trustee of the Commonwealth. Government has an affirmative duty to protect the commons for this and future generations. Government isn't just some annoying bureaucracy that we need to shrink so the free market can take over and make everything efficient. There's more to government than the national defense and giveaways to private companies, and there's certainly more to government than trying to balance competing interests like environmentalists and polluting interests and industries. The institutions that we have put into place on the local, state, national, and international levels are responsible for the commons. They are responsible for the well-being of the rivers, of the wildlife, of the air, of the internet, of the prairies, of the publicly funded research and seeds. 48 states have some version of the public trust doctrine, either in common law or in state constitutions. Let me give you one version that we can find in Hawaii, and I'm mentioning a warm state. I wrote this in winter in Iowa, so I was thinking, I was looking for warmer climes. And the Constitution of Hawaii says about the public trust, for the benefit of present and future generations, the state and its political subdivisions shall conserve and protect Hawaii's natural beauty and all natural resources, including land, water, air, minerals, and energy sources, and shall promote the development and utilization of these resources in a manner consistent with their conservation and in furtherance of the self-sufficiency of the state. All public natural resources are held in trust by the state for the benefit of the people. Now, there's only one thing they've got wrong in this, other than the word utilized, which is trying to impress us. Some lawyer must have written that. But the other thing is, I believe that it needs to be for all the creatures of Hawaii, for all of those beings in Hawaii. But the public trust does have, this doctrine has some wonderful corollaries. The first is that it establishes a time frame. As trustee of the Commonwealth, government is obligated to protect the resources for this generation, but also for future generations. And here I think about the Native American idea of thinking 7 generations out. And environmentalists have grappled with that for a long time, but this anchors that 7th generation in law. It says that that is part of the purpose of government. It gives us that time frame in its very framework. So it means that we cannot squander the clean air or pollute the rivers, leaving a degraded legacy for our grandchildren. It offers that long time perspective. The second corollary is that as a theory of property and economics, the public trust doctrine asserts the value of the Commonwealth and counters the idea that everything should be privatized because it's a more efficient use of the resource. Efficiency is just an absurd notion when it comes to things like the Grand Canyon or wildlife or public health. International institutions like the World Bank are forcing developing nations to privatize their government services. This is most evident in public water supplies. In places like South Africa, the poorest of the poor are now forced to buy water from a private company who owns the waterworks. This is a public health disaster because people who cannot afford tap water drink from polluted sources. The cost to society for privatizing water is incalculable when measured in the lives of children who die from diarrhea or another preventable disease. The third corollary, and the one I want to emphasize tonight, is that the public trust doctrine will require the precautionary principle. And here's a good definition of the precautionary principle, and it comes out of the Wingspread statement. It says, when an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. And all statements of the precautionary principle contain a version of that formula. So it really means that when the health of humans and the environment is at stake, it's not necessary to wait for scientific certainty to take preventive action, no matter what industry might say. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for scientific certainty. Scientific certainty is long in coming, and thank you for that. We're clapping for justice and for an ethic. Precaution does not work if it is employed only as a last resort and results only in bans or moratoriums. It is best linked to some basic practices such as exploring alternatives to possibly harmful actions. This is Mary O'Brien's work. This is the way we carry out the precautionary principle. It's more than an abstraction. It is looking for alternatives to those harmful activities rather than focusing all your attention on the data, on the decimal point and just how many parts per million is safe, where is that decimal point? We can do things like look for alternatives. And the principle also places the burden of proof on proponents of an activity rather than on the victims or potential victims of the activity. In the case of chemicals, shifting the burden of proof means that chemical companies have an obligation to test their chemicals, to disclose information about potential harm, to monitor the effects of those chemicals, and to pay for damage or cleanup. In addition, setting and working towards goals that protect health and the environment will necessarily use the precautionary principle. The example I give, especially when I'm in LA or a place like that, is we can reduce asthma. We know that asthma is preventable. We can set a goal. How many children do we want? How many children are in the emergency room, or how many children are prescribed inhaler? What's our goal? Can we start to reduce that? Can we have children who have healthy lungs who can breathe the air? We can set those goals and begin to meet them. And of course, imagining the future and setting goals and identifying alternatives requires democracy, the full participation of all of us. We simply cannot leave these decisions to scientists or agencies working in a vacuum. They need us, and we need them. We need each other. In the past, we waited for certainty about things like whether tobacco caused cancer before we took public health action. If government is to protect the Commonwealth for future generations, sometimes it will have to act before absolute proof is in the bag. It'll have to take precautionary action on the weight of the evidence. A key example is the mad cow debacle. Now, I'm not picking on the Northwest when I talk about mad cow. Oh, I am, but no. Government could have taken additional precautionary actions and not waited until BSE devastated the cattle industry and the U.S. food system. It could have required that any downed cow not be rendered or put into the food supply. It could have stopped feeding any animal parts to cows, including the blood meal that is sometimes still used as milk replacer for calves. But it didn't. It didn't do that. Some courts are recognizing that the precautionary principle is essential for government to fully function as the public trustee. The Hawaiian Supreme Court enforced the state's public trust responsibility towards surface water. And the story here is really wonderful. It's definitely, the little guy against the big guy, and government comes in on the side of the little guy and the water. But what had happened is there had been a diversion of surface water to big golf courses and huge corporate farms. And when some of the politics and the water dynamics changed, the little farmers went into court and sued under the public trust doctrine. And guess what the court did? They did the right thing. I love it when the courts do this. And the court said, the duty to protect public water resources is a categorical imperative. I threw that in because I'm in a university and because the court said it. For without such underlying protection, the natural environment could, at some point, be irrevocably harmed, and the duty to maintain the purity and flow of our waters for future generations and to assure that the waters of our land are put to reasonable and beneficial uses could be endangered. And the court said, where scientific evidence is preliminary and not yet conclusive regarding the management of freshwater resources, which are part of the public trust, it is prudent to adopt precautionary principles. They made it plural, so there are a lot out there. We've got to discover some more in protecting the resource. In addition, where uncertainty exists, a trustee's duty to protect the resource mitigates in favor of choosing presumptions that also protect the resource. Isn't that wonderful? There's one other secret about the precautionary principle that I want to whisper in your ear. It sets us free to speak about values and ethics. We do not have to leave our hearts behind when we are using our heads. The marvelous author Terry Tempest Williams says that the precautionary principle is restraint in the name of reverence. Restraint in the name of reverence. Reverence within the context of the precautionary principle invites us to act, even act politically, out of what James Hillman, the great Jungian, says are the aesthetic reverberations of truth in our souls. That truth has an aesthetic reverberation. Don't you love that idea? It's humming, it's singing, it's speaking about beauty. Hillman insists, were our aesthetic responses to awaken, we would not need the admonitions implied by the principle of precaution, not even Hippocratic warnings and Socratic omens. The individual human's aesthetic response would alter the very course of history and the shape of things we live among. Our noses, too, and our eyes and ears are political instruments. Think about that. Isn't that wonderful? Our eyes and our ears, our noses, our tongues are political instruments. They are protesters. An aesthetic response is a political action. We too know instinctively, aesthetically, when a fish stinks. And I also think when a Walmart is ugly. When the sense of beauty is offended. Standing for these moments, and these moments occur each day, within every airless office building, and when we're seated in that crippling chair, inundated by senseless noise and fattened on industrial food, that BSE and that salmon contaminated with PCBs, that standing for our responses, these aesthetic reverberations of truth in the soul, may be the primary civic act of the citizen, the origin of caution and of the precautionary principle itself, with its warnings to stop, look, and listen. And he didn't add in, and to sniff and to taste. So can we practice restraint in the name of reverence together? Can we find new ways to insist that our governments fully take on their role as trustee of the Commonwealth? Where do we start? I've got some ideas. That's probably why you asked me to talk here tonight. And I offer these, though, in the spirit of collaboration and dialogue. And I offer them in the hope that you'll come up with many, many more than I offer tonight. And I'm going to start out with the ones that you can do at home. Nancy Myers, who's on our staff, often says, don't leave this to the experts, try this at home. So here are a couple. First, you can establish a Commons Audit Committee in your community. You can audit the Commons, just like you have an audit committee for a major corporation. Harriet Barlow says this, all Americans are joint owners of a trove of hidden assets. These assets, natural gifts like air and water, and social creations like science and the internet, constitute our shared inheritance. They're vital to our lives and make our economy run. Though it's impossible to put a precise value on them, it's safe to say they're worth trillions of dollars. I actually think they're worth many, many more than trillions of dollars. The trouble is our shared inheritance is being grossly mismanaged. Maintenance is terrible, theft is rampant, and rents often aren't being collected. To put it bluntly, our Commonwealth and our children's is being squandered. So establishing your own Commons Audit Committee and reporting back to the shareholders, to the public, will give you a sense of the health and well-being of your Commonwealth, of our Commonwealth. And then you can do something about it. You can set those goals, you can choose alternatives. We don't have to tolerate the Enronization of our Commonwealth. We don't have to tolerate it. Another thing that you can try at home is you can develop a set of questions by which you evaluate proposals that affect the commons. This is related to alternatives assessment. You can ask, does this proposal, whether it's a mall, a road, a park, a restoration of a wetland, does this increase the health, safety, and beauty of my community? Peter Montague, a colleague of ours and president of our board, says we should also ask whether this proposal increases gender, racial, or class inequities. So you can imagine when they're closing a school and working mothers in my neighborhood in North Dakota means that a mother going to her child's volleyball game has to drive hours and hours and makes it much more difficult to do all the other things that she's doing with and for her family. And that's one that increases a whole lot of problems and inequities. And then another question suggested by Wendell Berry is, how many times does a dollar circulate in your community? The fewer times a dollar circulates, the more likely it is that you have a colonial economy, where wealth is extracted from the community and sent somewhere else. Isn't that what we were doing with all of our colonial economies? You mine it, you rip and tear, and you send that value and that wealth somewhere else. So when you begin asking questions like these, you'll find alternative methods for reducing inequities, ensuring beauty, and ending colonial economies. And then the third one is one I think that we need to do together. So it's not one you can do in your own home, but you can start in your own home, and then we can gather together in the town square. We can craft our own political agenda based on the public trust doctrine, rather than the protection of private property. A political agenda that would end the death spiral of this suicide economy, and instead be anchored in our most elegant sensibilities. And here are some of the possible components, and I'm coming closer to the end, Martha, so get ready. The political agenda would require that politicians be truthful. David Abram defines truth a little differently, though, and I'd like to adopt this definition. We all know the one about accurate, static facts, which is what we're rebelling at a little bit with the precautionary principle. He says, truth is a style of thinking that associates truth with a quality of relationships. Ecologically considered, it is not primarily our verbal statements that are true or false, but rather the kind of relations that we sustain with the rest of nature. A human community that lives in a mutually beneficial relation with the surrounding earth is a community that lives in truth. By mutually beneficial relationships, I mean relationships of reciprocity. The political agenda would recognize that humans are only one vote in a parliament of 30 million. The political agenda of the rest of the parliament, the gray whales, the ruby-throated hummingbirds, the crayfish, the coyote, must also be honored, or they will guarantee that we will move ever faster on our death spiral. We cannot tax the ecosystem beyond its ability to regenerate. We cannot tax the ecosystem without representation. The vote isn't in yet. What do the wolves have to say about the election? What does Coyote have to say about the election? The political agenda will be fully local, a politics of place, not money. Wendell Berry says there are two political parties, not Republicans and Democrats, or communists and capitalists, but the party of globalization and the party of local community. Berry makes the case that the party of which I am a member, the party of local community, is a real party with a real platform and an agenda of real and doable work. He offers us hope that this is possible when he says people are seeing more clearly all the time the connections between conservation and economics. They are seeing that a community's health is largely determined by the way it makes its living. And he goes on to describe that a little bit more, and I will move to the next one, which is that the political agenda will express community values. The current agenda emphasizes individual values like liberty and privacy and family values like marriage. But community values help us live together in both the human community and the biotic community. These are values such as respect, humility, compassion, humor, and the golden rule. And then the last one is that the political agenda will recognize that the only true power is a power of communion rather than coercion. Communion as power is a basic underpinning of the trust part of the public trust doctrine. We know from our experience with the wild world that control and coercion don't work very well. Nature can be chained and enslaved, but eventually she breaks free and in ways that can be destructive to the human community. I came to the realization that communion was the truest sense of power the year I began working for the Science and Environmental Health Network. At the time, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. And a colleague of mine reflected on the changes Gingrich had brought about in the political agenda of Congress with his contract with America. My colleague asked me when I had power. Whoa! My gut level response was that Gingrich's form of power, that his form of power, and even my mangling of his name, is corrosive to the body politic. It undermined the public trust necessary to advance the common good. And later that day, my friend David Klein, author of Scratching the Woodchuck and Great Possessions in Amish Farmer's Journal, told me that he'd petted an owl in the woods. I asked him what the owl had gotten out of it. David laughed at my impish question, but he didn't have a response. Coincidentally, a Navajo medicine man called me about that time, and I took the liberty of asking him what power is. And he stopped and said, power is when you have the ability to communicate with all the beings, and they have a willingness to communicate with you. This is power as communion. This is the kind of power that will engender the public trust. This is the kind of power that will enable us to take precautionary action on behalf of those things we love and revere. I began with Barry Lopez, and I end with his wise and startling admonition. Pay attention to the mystery. Apprentice to the best apprentices. Rediscover in nature your own biology. Write and speak with appreciation for all you have been gifted. Recognize that a politics with no biology, or a politics without field biology, or a political platform in which human biological requirements form but one plank is a vision of the gates of hell. If you are like me and think we are standing too close to the gates of hell right now, let's begin a new experiment. Let's invite our governments and politicians to new roles as trustees of the Commonwealth. Let us practice restraint in the name of reverence. Let us use precaution. Let us pay attention to the mystery. Thank you.
As you spoke of colonialism, I thought, as a Nicaraguan, a good way that I've internalized colonialism is that I really believe in democracy, and I grew up really believing in the American dream, and so I've always had a very Pollyanna attitude about everything. Well, that's wrong. We should just fix that. And I pretty much approached every organizing challenge that way. And as I sat in a room with a bunch of other health educators, who were all working very diligently to get more women into early detection and really believing that that's how we were going to prevent women from dying from breast cancer. And while it does prevent many women from dying from breast cancer, it doesn't prevent breast cancer. And then I heard these folks, another poet, Sandra Steingraber, talking about how chemicals end up in our body. And I'm sitting there at lunch getting madder and madder and thinking, this is just not right. They don't have a right to put these chemicals in my bodies. Now, if I decide to do these things, that's a very different story. The chemical companies do not have this right. And I turned to my boss, who was, sort of used to me being very fiery and getting in Spanish, algo entre ceja y ceja, and it's, you get something between your eyebrows and you don't let it go. And I said, I'm quitting. And he goes, yeah, right. You always say that when you're pissed off. A few weeks later, there's a job announcement with Physicians for Social Responsibility saying they were looking for someone who knew how to organize in the health community, to do all this stuff. And I thought, well, let me just apply for the job. And I go on the job interview, and there was that moment. I don't know if you've ever been on a job interview where you're like, you better give me this job. And they kind of realized it too. That was sort of a match. I don't know where it was made, but it's been an amazing experience. Primarily because it gave me a place to put that anger and rage, and I'm not like Carolyn, a pacifist, and I'm usually ranting and raving about something or other. And what the Precautionary Principle did was a really positive way, and luckily I didn't have to learn risk assessment, which I thought just didn't make any sense at all. And as I did this work, because I come from a background on social justice, as they said earlier, I've been organizing since I was very young, and have always been, extremely upset. My mom said from a very young age, very upset at things that weren't fair or just. And so they thought either I would end up in jail or changing the world. So when I started doing this work and organizing within the environmental community and really talking about pesticides as a health issue, something happened in Los Angeles, and that was that we passed the first ever integrated pest management policy for a school district, one of the largest school districts in the country, that had as its preamble the Precautionary Principle. And it was just about the time I started working there. I don't like being kind of stuck behind there. So about this time, right when I started working there, we passed this policy. And I remember actually going to South by Southwest in Austin right before I started my job, and I came back, and my first event was a press conference for this policy. And I thought the preamble sounded great. Yeah, if activity raises the threat of harm to human health and the environment, we should act preventive, even if all, it makes perfect sense, right? I just thought they were pretty words at a preamble of a policy. And it took me a while to figure out the beauty of how the principle works. And I'm all about, my background in political theory was always about, well, that sounds really good, but what is that in practice? And so it took me a while to be able to articulate how precaution works when you put it in a public policy. And so how it worked at LAUSD was that we took a list of 134 products that were being used around children and asked ourselves, is this a known, possible, probable carcinogen? Should we be using it on children? Is there a better way to get rid of this bug? Yes to all, and well, no, we shouldn't be using it. Yes, there's an alternative. Should it be on the list? Should it be on the list?
Yeah.
No. No, it shouldn't. It's a known, possible, or probable carcinogen. Should we be using it around kids? There's a really safe alternative. No. There's a known, possible, or probable reproductive toxins. Should it be used around children? Absolutely not. And so how the precaution, free. Yay. My dreams. And so the other part of precaution that was built into this policy was public participation. We have a community advisory team made up of a physician, nurse, public health department, staff of the district. I'm the representative from the environmental community. There's representatives from parents. We couldn't settle on student participation in the beginning because they couldn't figure out how to do it. But we have an equal vote on the approved list, on practices, everything. We have an equal vote with the school district. This did not make the school district very happy. And we went from having 4 or 5 hour horribly conflicting meetings. The parent activists who made this policy happen in 1 year were not always accustomed to the glacier pace at which the district moved to make any changes. We implemented the policy in a way that probably, in retrospect, we shouldn't have done. We did the training last, and the policy first. And so what we did is the spray jockeys, as we like to call them, there was a whole spray unit, and we didn't realize that as soon as you got rid of the spray unit, we had built-in opposition. And so teachers would call, we have a roach problem, and the spray jockey would say, well, I can't do anything up. Instead of calling facilities to come out and check out what the problem was. And so there was an amazing amount of resistance from people who said, we don't want to do bad things to children. You know, we're public servants. We really want to help children. So you begin to see, when Carolyn talks about the public trust doctrine, and if any of you have ever worked for the state or for a public agency, well, you have to enforce the public trust. You have a public duty to live to the mission of the organization you work for. Is this on yet? Yeah. Okay. And what we were seeing is that this has often failed. Often, that stupid thing. But if you're on the internet, this is a great little program to get rid of data miners so that they're not sending cookies and yucky emails to you. Okay. Well, you get to enjoy the flaming June for a little while. And so what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to show you some case studies of work that we've done in the state of California and in Southern California. Things do happen in the environmental movement, in primarily the environmental justice movement in Southern California, something we have a hard time convincing our Northern California friends of. So I shouldn't propagate the war between the North and the South, but I do. Okay. Yes. There we go. Okay. Failing the public trust. And a friend of mine, Lou Cole, who has been doing environmental justice work for many years, talks about the 3 great American myths. First one, the government is on your side. Second one is the truth will set you free. And the third is that we need a lawyer. Sorry, Carolyn. And nowhere are these 3 great American myths great, stronger, and most obviously seen that in the environmental justice movement, where you begin to see that there's a problem of illness in your community, and you go to your health department, and they fail you miserably. So these are, anyone here from the health department in California? They're not going to like me after this one. I don't know how to do next on this. Just press him. So I'm going to give you some case studies in the failing of how California, the failure of the public trust, but also some of the hopeful signs. We have been spurred on by Carolyn's poetry and Mary's wonderful work on alternatives and all the folks at the Science Environmental Health Network, and an amazing group of Southern California and Northern California advocates have really been figuring this out. How do we make precaution work? How do we put it into public policy? More importantly, what tools do we give to public servants so that they can do it well? So, cancer clusters in California. Never found one. Have yet to find a cancer cluster in California. I just had a conversation this morning with one of the local activists. Dee Lewis is a real estate agent in Sacramento, and South Sacramento has some of the highest breast cancer rates and other cancer rates in California, as high as what's going on in Marin County, but it's a low-income community, and so Marin County is getting all the attention. I'm talking fast, I'm out of breath. As you can see, I was really excited about this lecture. So the state of California has never found a cancer cluster. One of the best, most elaborate tumor registries in the country, one of the first, groundbreaking. But lo and behold, that's not been funded, and the cancer cluster unit has not been well funded in a long time, and also their definition of what a cluster is not very good. So these folks, Dee Lewis and her friends in South Sacramento, called the Department of Health Services when their doctor found 2 children within 6 weeks of each other diagnosed with acute lymphocytic leukemia. Very rare. And to have 2 children in the same block diagnosed within 6 weeks of each other alarmed a doctor. Keep in mind, most physicians get maybe 6 hours of training in their entire life about environmental health. So the fact that he even thought maybe something's happening in the environment was a big thing for a doctor. So they called the health department. Well, it's not statistically significant. Never mind that it's already, this is 2 in one area that close is very rare. Well, over the next 2 years, they found 8 more cases. But the way the tumor registry classifies what is a cluster, it wasn't statistically significant. So they kept calling the Department of Health Services. At this point now, the community has become expert in GIS mapping, in tumor information, in how the tumor registry runs. Yet every time they called the Department of Health Services, the department would come out and say, there is nothing wrong here. They had other options, other than saying, you know, that is kind of strange. You've got 8 cases in one area where that's, you know, 5 times the normal. Maybe there is a cause for concern, and let's find out what used to be under your houses. Well, what was under their houses was a former military toxic site, and they built the houses over it. And so now, who is responsible for the health problems of that community? Well, if they're insured, their insurance company, they're really paying for it, or the state becomes responsible. So at what point does the health department understand that it is, if we look at it in their self-interest way, it is in their self-interest to actually say there may be something wrong here, because it begins to allow us to talk about recovering some of those costs for the health care. But it is, again, one of the failures of the public trust. And this has happened throughout the state of California in many different communities. The health department has hidden behind the idea of sound science and absolute certainty. And instead of saying, you know, we should, can I get the next slide, actually? I have major battles with the Department of Health Services. And so in the midst of this battle where I'm like, I am not fighting for more money for you to go out in communities and not be on their side and not protect their public health. Why am I going to go do this? Why am I going to go tell communities of color that you need more health education money, or that we should put more money in your department for our health tracking bill until you guarantee us that you're going to be on the side of communities? So in the midst of this, a friend of mine who I actually knew when she was getting her MPH, very hurt, Martha, why? These emails, heartfelt emails, why are you doing this? I mean, I know you're a health educator. I know you're passionate about doing this. And then she sends me this quote, which she shouldn't have done. Because I open up the email while I'm on a conference call with a bunch of lead heads about lowering lead levels. And I'm always multitasking. So I'm reading this, and I'm hearing a public health nurse. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. Public health nurse from LA County is saying, I don't know why you people are so concerned with changing the action level of lead from 10 to 5. I mean, what people in my lab tell me is that if we have a lead level of 5, that actually could mean that maybe it's 2 or 1, because there's a margin of error, a standard deviation, and this blah, blah, decimal point, blah, 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 and I'm like, and I'm opening up this email where she is, can you hit the next, did you all see this? This is the responsibility of the health educator. This is codification of the public trust. That when you become a health educator with the state, this is what you're charged with. And here's, when a conflict arises, it is not to say there's nothing wrong. That is not your public trust duty. And so the fact that this was, those two things are happening at the same time, and so I say to the person, on the phone, I don't tell her about this, but I did send her this later. I said, well, it could be 1 or 2, but what happens if we change that action level? Well, it means more work for me. Well, why does that mean more work for you? Well, that means we have to do an intervention. And I said, well, no, you don't have to do a medical intervention. It just simply means that we figure out a way to make sure that every child that gets tested, first you have to enforce the universal testing. In California, we have a law that every child who receives public assistance must be tested. Well, most California doctors, when you talk to them about lead, will say, what are you talking about? Lead is an East Coast problem, not a West Coast problem. And look at our screening data, it'll tell you that. Well, less than 10% of the children who should be screened are being screened. And just from some of the work we've done in some clinics, we're finding that about half or more of the kids have some level of lead. And so back to my first slide where I said we're using children as lead detectors. They're coming into a clinic with a level of between 0 and 5, and we're sending them home without any information about how to get rid of that lead hazard. And here is again a failure of the public trust. And a little later I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done around coalition building, where the precautionary principle has really inspired people to go out and do creative ways of working together to get around departments of resistance. So when I read this, I'm like, well, that means that when they call the health department in that community in South Sacramento, they should have been out there with the community saying, who's responsible for this site? Who's going to clean it up? And how do we relocate these folks? And I'm thinking in English and Spanish for a strange reason, but how do we buy back those homes? Because a lot of folks, this was their first time buying a house, they spent a lot of money, did a lot of work to get that house, and now they're finding out it's making the mail. And so, again, it's the stance that you take in terms of when do you know enough to act, and in whose interest will science be used. And that's how I essentially see precaution. In whose interest, and how will you decide? And the power of precaution is that for community members, they're like, I'm not crazy. And I've had folks who feel so embattled for years and years of fighting with the government agencies over contaminated sites. When they hear about precaution, they feel, oh my God, I had to go learn risk assessment. I had to be able to read these permits. I had to be able to read these technical documents and understand them. I shouldn't have had to, because all I had to say is, you should have prevented this mess. Or you should have at least fully disclosed and guaranteed my right to know that I was buying a house that was built over a DDT plant, and that they had buried a lot of the waste from that plant in my backyard, and maybe you might have told me I shouldn't have planted anything there when I moved in there. And so, again, those fundamental issues around precaution. When do you know enough to act? The right to know, and the right to participate. Meaningful participation. Those are essential parts of precautionary principle. They're also essential parts of the environmental justice movement. And the environmental justice movement has used the tools of science, the law, and community organizing to implement precaution and to fight for it. So in California, when we had the first ever precautionary principle workshop, a month later we had the first meeting of the California Environmental Justice Advisory Committee Working Group. I think I got that right. It's a long name. But this was based on a law that a lot of us worked to pass, and it said that every board and department of the California Environmental Protection Agency had to develop an environmental justice work plan. So that means the Department of Toxic Substances, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, the air districts, all of them. And at that first meeting, they had the meaningful participation part, open forum, everybody talks, at the open mic part. Decisions are made later, and we don't think that that's meaningful participation, but what many of the advocates came up and said is, we want you to implement the precautionary principle. And it immediately made many people very nervous. But it also meant, but we also find some interesting allies among the public agencies who thought, what does this mean, and how can I use this as a tool to do my job better? And we've seen that. We've seen well-meaning public servants who say, this gives me a way around risk assessment, this gives me a way around the limits that I have found in my day-to-day job to actually make a difference, which is why they took the jobs in the first place. I think that's the last slide. Don't remember now. I just wanted you to see the Code of Ethics. I was really struck by that. It's a very long document. If you type Code of Ethics Health Educator in Google, you'll get the whole 3 pages. Now, this is what I do. I'm an organizer, and we have done an amazing amount of organizing using precaution in the state of California. So I'm going to tick off some of the things that we've done. I don't think I've even given this list to Carolyn or Mary yet. Where precaution has been invoked, where the idea of uniting this concept of public health, protecting public health, limiting harm, and disproportionate impacts on communities have come together to make real changes. We have this on December 13, 2001, the South Coast Air Quality Management District passed an environmental justice work plan that said explore the concept of precaution and develop more precautionary policies. And they've done that, and part of that was to have the workshop, and now we are looking at the Air District actually developing tools for community air monitoring and giving it to communities. Because of that work, they actually opened up their warehouse to Susan Kegley, a scientist with the Pesticide Action Network, and said, take whatever you need, and we were developing a pesticide drift kit. And basically, the Air District doesn't always like the Department of Pesticide Regulation, let us use some of their scientific equipment, and we now have a drift catcher. And it is, it's kind of like the bucket brigade concept, but it's a big plastic box. And it has a bunch of little tools, and you go hang it on a tree, hang it near a community where there's pesticides. It will analyze up to 125 chemicals. Had we not been pushing this concept of precaution, had there not been public servants who said we really want to help communities, they wouldn't have opened that up. We wouldn't have this amazing tool now. And again, the Senate Select Committee on Environmental Justice has said, well, we want to do a hearing, we want a demonstration. So they're going to do a hearing in the Central Valley with us, and we're bringing the drift catcher, and we're going to do a community demonstration for the Select Committee. And what's exciting about that is going to bring urban Latino elected officials into the Central Valley to be able to pressure Central Valley Latino Democrats who've been very weak on ag reform. Bring these groups together, and we hope that means real progress in California around pesticide regulation and really dealing with the drift issue, which is pesticides. No, most fumigants do not stay where they're supposed to; they go off-site. That's one. Take a breath. We recently passed a 15-year ban on the chemical perchloroethylene, which is the chemical that's used in dry cleaning. God, that was a huge, horrible fight. We didn't do it very well. We didn't do our organizing. And we brought doctors and others to testify before the Air District. But because we didn't do our organizing, and the environmental community had not really learned how to work in multi-ethnic coalitions, before going for the rule, didn't bother to sit down with the dry cleaning owners, who were 85% of them Korean. And so the chemical industry helped create a group called the Korean Dry Cleaners Association, who were really good about bringing out Korean owners. And it became an issue. They invoked environmental justice as a reason for not banning perchloroethylene. After a long battle, and again, we didn't do our organizing. We did not know how to work in a community we weren't used to working in. And the chemical industry beat us to it, and they organized them, and they did a good job. And so we weren't able to, we won a ban, but it's 15 years out. But we got the attention of state legislators, and now we do have a ban on perchloroethylene and a polluter pay initiative that will place a 10-cent tax on every barrel of perchloroethylene produced. That fund goes into a technology transfer fund. And so as you rebuy your machines, you have to go to the new cleaner technology. So again, at every hearing, at every testimony, the idea of precaution, preventing harm, holding the polluter accountable, and the issue of science, we know this stuff is a cancer causer. Let's not argue anymore. And it was very interesting when the industry tried, they couldn't argue on the science. And so they used race and the fact that environmentalists could be portrayed as not caring about small business as a way to stop that. But, throughout that whole process, to hear regulators saying we have a duty to protect public health, and that's why we're moving forward, and it's the right thing to do. It wouldn't have happened 5 years earlier. But because we've created a mood in California, and particularly in Southern California, where public health and the environment are intricately linked, because we've done a lot of work to bring those two communities together. The big victory last year, and hopefully over the next few months we'll be able to maintain this and see how it actually works in practice, is that a result of the California Environmental Justice Working Group. It has been an incredible document on how California can move to ensuring environmental justice, and a central and the most hard-fought element is implementing the precautionary principle. It brought industry out, they attacked us, we brought Carolyn and a bunch of other folks to speak to the California EPA, and what was really exciting is when you see the head of Cal EPA ask the guy from one of the industry representatives, what's good science? Science you paid for? And again, the power of what precaution can do for well-meaning public servants. It is a tool that they can use that gets them beyond these limits that we are currently stuck in with the current regulatory practices. One of the first acts of the chemical industry when Schwarzenegger took office was to write a memo called the Thursday Group Memo, and it attacked precaution. And there was all these calls and emails, what should we do? What should we do? We have to respond to this. And most of us said, no, we don't. It means industry is on the ropes. They're very nervous about the power of the environmental community, the public health community coming together and both saying the same thing. We should be preventing harm wherever we can, and the way we do that is by implementing the precautionary principle
And two, making sure that our main concern is protecting public health. That we put values back into the way we're making decisions. We don't know what's going to happen with the new governor. I'm just going to say it, Governor Schwarzenegger. Because I said it earlier and people really reacted. And we don't know what's going to happen. The lines have been very severely drawn. We've been working on a bill to ban the use of the worst pesticides in schools. And it was really interesting to go up against the $1 million lobbyist. And we had, Clorox, and you see these very blonde women, very thin, with short skirts and high heels, walking around the Capitol. And everywhere we went to do a lobby visit, there they were. And we'd walk into Senate offices and they'd go, oh, here come the healthy schools people, no more. We've gotten more letters, more calls on this healthy schools bill than on my health care reform bill. But it didn't matter. What happened is the Ag Committee pulled the bill out of education where it should have been, was heard in Ag, and we got just beat up by the Ag Committee. And the questions came down to issues of risk assessment. So here's one of the questions, and they wouldn't let me answer. They asked the doctor there, has any one of your patients that you've ever seen in the ER room, do you know for a fact that the cancer they got was caused by that pesticide used in that school? They wouldn't let him answer. So again, it is where these issues really come to play, and our next big effort is really to begin to pick off some of those legislators that we think we can work with so that they are well versed in the language of risk assessment and how to use this language of prevention and precaution. Because we just got beat up that day. And we're hoping the bill will be rescued in the next few weeks. And a strange ally has actually been the governor, who is deeply concerned with the asthma epidemic, deeply concerned with children. And when he did his State of the Union address, and I didn't vote for him, I'm not supporting him, but I was stunned that he talked about the economy, the economy, economy. The only two other things he said is deeply concerned with the environment and children's health. So we are hoping that those are openings. We just delivered to him a white paper on environmental health, and we never used the word precaution. We talked about public health and prevention. And he's been very open with it, to it. He's going to be meeting with a number of us to talk about what our agenda is. And we're hoping that because he has this vision of the hydrogen economy and the hydrogen future, that he will be more open to this idea that we should be preventing harm, that we should have a longer view picture of things, and we'll see what happens, at least till the next election. Some of the other victories where precaution has been invoked has been this growing number of asthma advocates. The California Endowment, which was created when one of the health insurance companies went private, is one of the largest foundations in the country. They have lots of money. They've been spending lots of money on their personal sort of initiatives. And one of the initiatives that they created was one to reduce indoor and outdoor asthma triggers for children. And so what they did is they funded a lot of groups who'd been doing clinical care around asthma, and suddenly said to them, it's not enough to treat a child, although it's the best way to deal with asthma. Asthma, if it's well managed, is a manageable disease. What's happened is that we're not managing it. And so most of our children are ending up in emergency rooms when they don't need to because they don't have a medical home with primary care. And here is where we've begun to talk about precaution to folks who are working on healthcare access, who get it immediately. And so we've partnered with folks who are trying to increase access to children's health and saying, well, I'm glad you're talking about making sure that kids are covered, but we really should be talking about reducing the triggers, because that's what's sending kids to the ER room. And so we've 14 coalitions throughout the state of California. Because they were really heavily focused on the clinical piece, they did not really have an experience working on policy. So they called our organization, and they said, well, would you be interested in working with these asthma coalitions? And I said, oh, yes. Because a year earlier, I had seen the request for proposal for this asthma coalition, and I just didn't have time to apply for the grant. And a year later, that same funder came to us and said, we want you to help these groups develop public policy responses to triggers. So one of the first things I did is I'd like to give a talk to all 14 on precaution. And they all, because they're public health people, said, yes, we want to do that. So what we've actually been working now is on diesel reduction strategies. And it's an amazing thing to see, parents and children who live next to the Port of LA. in the most polluted areas in California, who, kids on bad ozone days and on bad pollution days are getting sent to the hospital. And we're now doing trainings for them so that they can be the advocates who go to the state of California and advocate for real changes in the way the ports are run. And one of the first victories was a change in idling rules. Because you'd have trucks idling, the port comes, the trucks get loaded, there's 34,000 trips a day on one particular freeway, huge diesel problems. And now you have a coming together of the folks like Coalition for Clean Air, our organization, who have been pushing for prevention, new diesel rules, and asthma folks, and parents and kids and doctors and nurses who every day are dealing with asthma. And again, the thing that unites people is this idea that we should be preventing further harm, and that we could limit the burden on the healthcare system if we act up front. Fundamental issues around precaution. And the other part is this public participation. Residents saying no more. And we should change this. And so it's been really exciting to see the Asthma Coalition's work. The other amazing work that's being done is with the folks who are working around lead poisoning. And when I first started talking about precaution to the lead collaborative, they said, we've been using kids as lead detectors, we're sending them home. The collaborative decided, as we started doing some of this organizing, that we should look at more than lead. There are more health hazards in the home than just lead. And so they began to say, well, let's look at asthma triggers, let's look at lead, but let's look at chemicals that are used in the home. And so we're looking at particularly low-income and public housing and what are the substandard housing conditions that are giving rise to the health problems. And again, what we're doing is, how do we prevent this? But also putting the tools of science and democracy in the hands of residents. We've trained 50 community residents to do lead sampling, lead dust sampling, to do bucket brigades, how to use a particulate meter, which you go out and you take a sample and it tells you what the particulate matter count is in a community. So we're really training communities in the use of science tools that then they take into policymakers to say, we're going to change these policies. And I'll take one of the victories. It was an unintended victory. 50 residents descended on this little town of Maywood, and we call it Maywood the armpit of Vernon, which I have a map of California. Vernon is an industrial community with 300 evening residents. In the daytime, there's several thousand because it's all industry. People leave. At the end of the day, very few homes are left there. But it is one of the biggest sources of contamination. There's pesticide manufacturers, lots of diesel, just a lot of it, recycling plants that are putting out, glass particulates, really contaminated area. And here's Maywood with a few residents who are living there, who have no rent control. It's an unincorporated area of Los Angeles. They were being evicted from their apartments so that they could build more warehouses because it's on the tracks from the port down the freeway to downtown and into Riverside, so that everybody can get their great Walmart equipment. The day that we took the trainers, we had 50 people walking through the streets of Maywood, taking dust mite samples in homes, soil samples, and air samples. Well, they got the city council really nervous. And so to buy off the residents, they said, well, we're going to delay the demolishing of your apartments for 15 years. And they thought that would sort of end the efforts. Well, what's now begun to happen is after they've got the initial results of the sampling, we found that there's a real intersection between what's inside the home and what's outside. So we found some of the highest lead levels we've ever found. We found some of the highest particulate matters we ever found. And residents who've never been active, they're undocumented, who've never been, who've not been politically active, who organized a rent strike for 6 months in 6 buildings, who have now decided that they're going to take on this diesel issue and the truck issue and are fighting the expansion of the 710 freeway. And it's a way of using science and making it democratic and putting it in the hands of communities so that they can begin to push for this changing of the burden of proof. And we call it participatory action research, and it's actually research that the time between it gets studied and actually makes it to policy change is brief. Data is owned by communities. It's not owned by the researchers. And they decide how it will be used. And all of this in California California is truly exciting, and there's about 40 different organizations. It's not just PSR, it's many different groups that are doing this work. And I do a lot of speaking and saying how you use precaution, how you organize in the medical community, how we train doctors, but it's also how we begin to train community members to use these tools effectively for policy change. And it's really exciting. Okay, I have a few more minutes. We had a conversation at lunch, and I want to talk a little bit about how you make systems change. And one of the examples is what this Healthy Homes Collaborative did. When they started 10 years ago as the LED Collaborative, their enemy was apartment owners and the housing department. Major battles, many years have passed. We just got a brand new bill called SB 460, which makes disturbing any lead paint a code violation. So that means that now you sell a home, you can't go to scrape it, disturb it, you have to use lead-safe practices. And it was a coalition of the Healthy Homes Collaborative, that used to be the LED Collaborative, working actually with the housing department, saying, well, if you help us change this law, we can actually get some teeth and protect people from being, one, evicted when they complain about housing hazards, but two, making sure that you don't disturb the paint and make it more hazardous place. So we recently had a meeting where there was a grant given to the Department of Health Services to develop this lead elimination plan. And we hear the folks in the housing department, and it's a love fest between the folks in the housing department and the Healthy Homes Collaborative. And the housing department telling people from the health department, you should work with them, because they'll really make a difference. And yeah, we should lower that level, because it doesn't mean you have to do something, it means we have to do it. It means you can call us in, and it means you can call the community health promoters who can go in a home and talk to people about their lead hazard. And so that was when you begin to see trust built, an institutional change, and suddenly people who would normally not work together, work together. And it is how government should work, in partnership with communities to protect communities. So I'm going to end there and open it up to questions. And I'm never as poetic as Carolyn, and so I'm always, that's what I aspire to be. That's when I saw the thing, I'm like, that just can't be me. I don't get to play with the big kids,
Is this? I'm Mary O'Brien, and I was asked just briefly to give some examples of work around the precautionary principle and public trust that are going on here in Oregon, to follow up on the wonderful stories of Marta in California and the principles and impulses behind the precautionary principle and public trust work that was described by Carolyn. The first of these four examples I'll give has to do with the potential to adopt precautionary principle ordinances here in Oregon. I believe the precautionary principle ordinance that was adopted by the City and County of San Francisco in July 2003 is the finest and most practical articulation of the precautionary principle I have ever seen. And I made lots of copies of this ordinance, and I'm going to put it on the table along with a brief description of all four examples I'm giving in contact references. You can pick that up after. Well, next month, on March 6th, which is a Friday, Debbie Raffel, the Toxics Reduction Program Manager for San Francisco's Department of the Environment, will be here in Eugene for two separate occasions. In the afternoon on that Friday, March 6th, she'll be speaking in the University of Oregon's Law School on a panel on San Francisco's Precautionary Principle Ordinance during the university's annual Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. And you don't have to sign up for the whole conference to go to a given panel, and I really, if you have been inspired tonight about the precautionary principle, I would urge you to consider, they haven't set the exact date, whether it'll be, time. They know it's March 6th, Friday in the afternoon. the students are just this week in the law school finalizing the exact times. On Friday morning, March 6th, I'm arranging for Debbie to meet with local government people and activists to have a 2-hour conversation about the relevance of San Francisco's precautionary principle for ordinance for communities here in Oregon. If you would like to join that discussion on Friday morning, please contact me. It's a kind of invitation discussion, but I would, if any of you are interested in joining that discussion, please let me know. Give me your name and contact number. The second example involves Oregon Toxics Alliance, which is located here in Eugene at 12th and Lawrence. It's an honor for me to serve on the board of Oregon Toxics Alliance with Bob Amundsen, Joy Belsky's husband. Bob is an air scientist who is doing the kind of work that Marta described with the drift catcher with citizens in Northwest Portland. He has been helping with bucket brigades and the measurement of toxics, industrial toxics in Northwest Portland. But the campaign I was going to mention about Oregon Toxics Alliance is launching one called Vinyl Out of Oregon, or VOO. It aims at ending the use of vinyl in new construction by hospital, university, and faith-based institutions. The ultimate goal, of course, is to end the use of vinyl throughout Oregon. For instance, in your shower curtains. Bet you didn't know that, huh? Vinyl also, I can bet that most of your shower curtains are vinyl, and they shouldn't be. Vinyl, also called polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, is the worst known plastic, and yet huge amounts. 70% of all vinyl in Oregon is unnecessarily used in the construction industry for flooring, siding, window frames, piping, etc. Producing vinyl is a highly toxic industry for workers and the environment, and when materials containing vinyl burn, as in a house fire, dioxin is produced along with highly toxic chemicals, highly dangerous to the firefighters involved. The VOO campaign is based on practical alternatives for construction that avoid the known harms of vinyl. It's interesting, you may not know that the new business building here on University of Oregon campus is vinyl-free. It was built without vinyl. The practical alternatives for construction that avoid the harms of vinyl make arguments about claimed scientific uncertainty about particular decimal points, as Marta mentions it, about toxic risks of vinyl, makes them much less important. Here tonight, I don't know, David Monk, are you here?
Here he is.
Right there, stand up. And he's director of Oregon Toxics Alliance, and Lisa Arkin? She had to go. Program office manager for Oregon Toxics Alliance was here earlier. Dave has leaflets, maybe he could bring them up afterwards, on the VOO campaign, which is new. The third is precautionary principle and public trust example I want to give here in Oregon involves genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, in Oregon's food and agriculture. A campaign called Safe Food Campaign, although I personally prefer to avoid using the term safe, but that's a matter for other discussions, has been launched in Oregon, sponsored by Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. The two main efforts of the Safe Food Campaign are, one, to end the production of dairy products using engineered bovine growth hormone in Oregon, and two, prevent the growing of Oregon crops that are genetically engineered to produce pharmaceutical drugs within them, such as contraceptives or psychoactive drugs. Both practices, injecting dairy cattle with engineered growth hormone and growing crops that spread engineered drugs into the environment, are unnecessary and pose large risks of reducing the safety of food and agricultural products. Rick North is here. Rick, standing up back there. He also has a very fine handout on these two campaigns. He's director of the Safe Food Campaign and is happy to talk with you about this. And the fourth, an odd little one, involves a coalition that a hunter from Malala and I founded 2 years ago, but you've probably not heard of it, called Measure Against the Domestication of Elk, or Mad Elk. This coalition is made up of hunters and animal rights activists. It's very interesting when we get together. For our meetings, we eat different things. And conservationists. It has as its mission statement, and this relates to what Carolyn was talking about, public trust. Quote, in order to preserve and protect wildlife and the public commons, prohibit commercialization and domestication of elk and deer species native to Oregon. Now you think, now why are we spending so much time on that? One of many reasons these unlikely coalition partners are together is for their common ground that Oregon's wild deer and elk need to remain wild, not penned up. Another reason involves the disease called chronic wasting disease, or CWD, which is a prion disease like BSE, which is called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which means your brain, the cow's brain turns to a sponge, can cause the human disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which resembles Alzheimer's disease and which is 100% fatal, turning the human brain into a sponge. But farmed and transported elk are an invitation to bring CWD into Oregon's wild deer and elk and Oregon's food supply, and CWD spreads far more rapidly among elk and deer than mad cow disease does among cattle. It poses a major threat. We have 17 elk farms in Oregon, and we're hoping mad elk exists to make sure that eventually Oregon has none. I've given only 4 out of many examples of work here in Oregon to bring the precautionary principle and care for public trusts of air, water, food, and wildlife to the fore in our communities and state. All 4 of these campaigns, as with all of the campaigns that Marta mentioned, involve healthy coalitions and all offer positive alternatives to unnecessary dangerous practices. I believe these 2 elements, unlikely, vibrant coalitions and positive alternatives, are the 2 most essential ingredients for implementing the precautionary principle and raising the public trust to honor in our society. And I don't know if we're going to have time for questions and answers. The organizers will have to tell me, but I do want to close by saying we owe a great deal tonight to Bob Amundsen, who arranged with the Center for Study of Women in Society for an annual lecture, the Joy Belsky Lecture. We owe a lot to Dorothy Amundsen, his 92-year-old mother, 93? 92, who still teaches every day in Washington's public schools. And to Joy Belsky, an honest, dogged, courageous public interest scientist who devoted her years here in Oregon to the public lands, grasslands, streams, wildlife, and women that we have been blessed with in this state. Thank you, Bob.